All right. Well, welcome everybody to this talk in a series of comic studies research seminars, which will be our last for this semester. Today, I'm really personally excited to welcome Nick Sousanis to UEA. I've known Nick for a while, and I also had the pleasure of co-teaching with him when we were both postdocs at the University of Calgary. And since then, Nick's work and teaching has been an inspiration to me, and not least when him and I co-wrote a chapter for a book together on pedagogical approaches to comic studies education, and that was one of the sort of most fun writing experiences I've ever had. And since we originally had Nick scheduled to give an in-person talk on campus in March, just I think literally maybe the week of lockdown, I remember we were texting back and forth whether you could actually come. I'm excited that he's able to join us today on this Thanksgiving morning in San Francisco. So by way of formal introduction, Nick Sousanis is an Eisner-winning comics author and an associate professor in humanities and liberal studies at San Francisco State University, where he runs an interdisciplinary comic studies program. He is the author of Unflattening, originally his doctoral dissertation, which he wrote and drew entirely in comics form. Published by Harvard University Press in 2015, Unflattening received the 2016 American Publishers Association Humanities Award for Scholarly Excellence and the 2016 Lind Ward Prize for Best Graphic Novel. Sousanis' comics have appeared in Nature, the Boston Globe, and Columbia Magazine. So over to Nick.
Cool. Thanks, Frederick. It is, sorry we didn't do this in the spring. That was hard to believe that's the same year. What a thing that has been. We're like debating if I could come there, and then the whole world is shut down. And your screens you guys all disappeared. Was that on purpose?
Yes.
Oh, all right. Everyone's face disappeared. I thought I'd done something wrong. That was a lot of fun, both the teaching and the writing, and I hope we can join our two programs as we keep both growing forward here. So the plan today is tell you guys, I mean, it sounds like a bunch of people have read it, so I won't spend too much time on what Unflattening is, but I'll spend a little bit more time than I might normally have done on how I did it. So I'm going to jump into the share tray. My first time on a share tray, and just tell me if are you seeing the full screen now?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, so just to say, so yes, I did my dissertation entirely in comics form. It's important to say I didn't get to graduate school and say, ooh, comics would be cool. I was a comics person from a little kid, older brother reading comics to me. Batman's my first word, and I made my own comics as a little kid. And this character Lockerman, who makes a cameo in Unflattening in the chapter on imagination. And if you ever get to see some of those pages, the kinds of play of form and the awareness of form, it definitely makes sense that the kind of comics I make now are reflected in that. And I did some other things as an unpublished thing I did with my brother that does some of the sort of metaphorical things that I would do later. And as much as I was into comics, there's this big gap in my comics making, or at least my finishing comics making, and that's going to undergrad, where studying comics was not something you could do. And if you wanted to do intellectual things, definitely not something you can do. And I wanted to. So I studied mathematics, and I'm pleased with that. But I mean, it's really interesting to reflect on. Here we are with comics. I run a comics program for people who've never read comics, are in my classes and getting excited about it. And myself as a student who was really into them, it's not something you could do. So we've really come a long ways in a relatively short time. But in witnessing that, my own experience, I think there's something really interesting. And as a mathematician, people would always say, "Oh, you're so smart." And as a comics maker, people always say, "Oh, you're so talented." And I see my work and my teaching today as both trying to heal those kind of rifts where I see myself, I think I was a really clever mathematician and really talented at it. And I think as an art maker, it's allowed me to be a lot smarter than I could be without it. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and I think that's a big part of my work. So in my own comics making, again, there was this gap where I have a lot of unfinished, unpublished things for a decade or something. And then when I was in Detroit around the 2004 presidential election, I was asked to be in this art show, and I made this comic about security, which doesn't matter what it's about, but and it's very McCloudian, and obviously everyone here would be familiar with Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics and other works, and certainly a huge hero of mine and a friend of mine, and definitely that work showed the potential for what you could do with comics. And Scott has a particular style. Scott's avatar leads us through it, and I loved that for Scott, but very early I said I want to do something different. And so there was another show after the week after the election, and I turned to a different influence. This is Alan Moore and Melinda Gebbe's This Is Information, which was a 9/11 tribute book. And it does all this play of visual and verbal metaphor. And that really struck me as unleashing some kind of potential of comics that resonated really well with me. And probably that comic I did with my brother is definitely influenced as well. And so this piece I did later is called Show of Hands, and it's all about voting, or, show of hands. Everybody's got their hands up. So every single panel has something to do with a hand. And I quite literally smashed my avatar in the very first panel. And continue to explore this sort of thematic way of organizing information. So I continued that. I did this comic about games and art for an exhibition we put on in Detroit, and like here's this page about why games aren't just for kids, using all fictional rabbits. So that idea of sort of finding metaphorical things to talk about something else really became the heart of my work. And it's these pieces that when I came to Columbia, I said, this is what I want to do. And they let me in on that. And we're sort of going non-chronologically here. I've continued this with some political comics. This was 2008. This was about the ridiculousness in our country, at least, of red and blue states, which is never more true than this year. And really trying to find ways to get people to communicate across boundaries, using the comics form, using visual metaphor, which, again, I think we need more than ever. This was from this year. And so I got to Columbia, and right off at the start, I started making comics about the things I was studying. And this one was about my then 90-year-old philosophy of aesthetic education professor, Maxine Green. And I depicted her as a top, finding her energy rather than her appearance. I did a piece for my advisor, Ruth Vins, who was in English education, for a book on narrative research. And this comic is either about how we do research, or or drawing, or how we see. And it really depended on who read it, what you think it's about. That I think is sort of a hallmark of what I'm trying to do in comics, is to make things that are I've so much stripped out some of the specific language to their fields or to their jargon or any of those things, that the work can be interpreted by people from different fields in very different ways, or from different walks of life in very different ways. But I think the sort of kernel of what I'm after gets through to all of them. And that really came through in this. And so I think that's, if I think about my process, that's sort of formal decision number one, is that I really wasn't trying to illustrate things. I'm not saying, here's a bunch of ideas I have and I'm going to stick some pictures with them. It's much more generative between how the words and pictures speak to each other. And it's trying to find metaphors to talk about the things rather than to be more explicit with it. And I think the other part of this, and this comes from that games comic, is how much that the work becomes sort of constraint-based or game-based. And Bernard Suits in The Grasshopper defines, in his book, The Grasshopper, defines games as a voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. So like if you're thinking about tennis, if you stand at the net to serve, serving is kind of pointless, right? But not being able to cross the baseline when you serve makes the game interesting. And I think the kinds of rules I set up, and I think all comics makers do to some extent, the kind of rules you set up start to generate new possibilities that you don't anticipate. And so it's really a process for me of discovery. It's very rare that I have something figured out until I start making and letting the drawings take me somewhere, which we'll see much later. But this is the page about the terrible name comics have from Unflattening. And it's all centered around different aspects of roses. And this page came, I was kind of searching for something. It came from Shakespeare's A Rose by Any Other Name Would Smell as Sweet. So I stuck in comics there and then sort of reverse engineered it all to find all these things that talked about roses that I could also use to talk about comics, and playing with these parts until something made sense, until the words were suggesting pictures I wanted, until the pictures were suggesting words I wanted, and it all came together. And I do this, and throughout this talk, I'll probably show a few things of student work. I do this as an assignment now with my students, where I get them to, pick some sort of metaphor you want to explore a lot, and then use it in every instance throughout your comic. So this one on the left used spirals, and the one on the right used horses and zebras to talk about her identity. And I've continued this sort of metaphorical thing even in more concrete works. I did this comic for Nature on climate change for the Paris talks in 2015. And there I was very upfront that when they hired me to say I wasn't gonna, they wanted like the scientist person to walk around and explain climate change to them, I was the wrong person to hire. So I had to find some other way to do it. And in this comic, I thought so hard about the problem of climate change. Like, how do we solve it? And how do we get everybody to work together? And one of the biggest things I could think of was the Apollo project. And I started thinking about the scaffolding of the Apollo project. And because the talks were in Paris, I thought about the Eiffel Tower and how it's built. And I had this idea to them that I pitched to them with this page from my notes that said, I'm going to show this construction being built sort of periodically throughout the pages. And it'll sort of show this framework that's like coming together, but falling apart and slowly growing. And they looked at my scribbles and said, I don't know what you're talking about, but they didn't stop me. And in doing it, it turned out the very first climate change convention at the UN was called the Framework Convention, which I didn't know until I did the research. And so all these pieces came together. And without going into it, you can find this online. This frame shows up, and it shows up in each page just a little bit. It's it's this dizzying amount of information, but it was a way to sort of keep something to keep referring to throughout the comic. This framework that at the end sort of takes over the page. And then, as Frederick mentioned, this is an Eisner winning comic on the Columbia librarian Karen Green, the first comics librarian there. I only show it here, like it's a job I turned down a couple times when they asked me to do it. But when I had this idea that I could do it as a sort of referencing all the comics that she'd read, and I had a chance to sort of play with those styles, then it became something that tied into my teaching and my own interests, much more than sort of telling a straight story about her life. So Unflattening, again, this is my dissertation published by Harvard in 2015. And it never says what it's about. So I talk to lots of schools, and some people, are quite aware that it's about education, but I have other groups that are putting it in an entirely different context. For me, it's very much thinking about the sort of system of education as this series of steps, as this sort of things that are done to us, and where our education gets put into boxes, whether it's boxes of subject or time or space. And so we end up with this idea that if you study math and you study art, that's sort of a freakish thing. And if you find out that person also made their living as a tennis pro for most of their life, you say those things can't exist. But I think a big part of my argument is to say those boxes we've been drawing are artificial. Those are the not real things. So I think it's very much an argument to push back against the sort of you can't be in these multiple places. Because I had the word unflattening, which comes from how I thought about comics, which we'll get to in a bit. I referenced Edwin Abbott's Flatland, which I'm guessing a few of you have heard of, 1880s novella about the flat geometric inhabitants of this two-dimensional world. So squares, circles, triangles, lines that could move east and west and south and northward, but have no concept of upwards, no concept of things off their plane of existence. And so that's a big question for the book. What is upwards to us? What are the directions that we can't imagine because we can't see them? And so being in a school of education, being in a place where you're supposed to do a 12-point type, double-spaced, 1.5 by 1 by 1 by 1 inch margins, I really wanted to push back against that. Not to say there's anything wrong with textual work, but to say why is that what counts, and why are images something that don't count? So it's clearly a critique of that, and also to say, what are we missing when we're only using one kind of mode of experience, and what might we make visible when we bring others into the conversation? And as those of you who've read it would know, that I have this page about my dog, and I think the significance there, it was sort of an apology to say when I talk about ways of seeing, I really mean ways of knowing, much more metaphorically. So I wanted the dog to sort of explain that, but I think it sort of sums up a big part of the book, is that the dog's sense of smell isn't simply more nuanced, isn't simply stronger than yours and mine. It's more nuanced, which means, this room has been empty, so it's not a great example, but the dog would know if someone was in here earlier than me. The dog would know who was here yesterday. The dog would know maybe as far back a week what went on in this room, whereas I can come in and see the color of the table and what's here and what's not here. But the dog has access to layers of time that we simply don't. And so unflattening became this really simple idea that, this is not the same view as this. And what happens when we start to bring multiple views into our conversation? What do we make possible? And for me, this became an argument for comics, not just as this thing I love to do since I was a little kid, but a way to breathe in the worlds of both image and text and be a bit amphibious in it. And maybe step out of some of my own limitations and see some of those limitations for what they are, see them as sort of flat, and try to find some other ways of expression. So with that, and you guys are all still here, I can't see anyone at all right now. So Frederick, you still out there?
Yeah.
You're all there. You're all wrapped. All right, good. I don't have to spend a lot of time with you all talking about what is this thing called comics, so I won't. But I do think it's such an exciting time. Here both Frederick and I are at universities that have made degree granting programs around comics, which is sort of an unthinkable thing 20 years ago. And yet we look at the origins of comics over here, at least, the Yellow Kid is in 1890, so predating film. We look at Topfer, which is, even earlier, almost 200 years ago now. And we look at the kinds of things that MacLeod looks at and your sort of history of comics might look at. Like there's things that are comics like pretty much as long as we've been us. And it's not to say that, that Lascaux cave paintings are comics, but it is to say that people have been making sense of their world through image making, through image stories, as long as we've been us. And maybe that's really instrumental in us becoming who we are. And yet we still tend to, at the end of the day, push everything back into words and numbers. And so I think my Unflattening's had interesting success, but I don't think it has all that much new to say. I think we've been talking about the importance of visual communication for 150 years or something. But at the end of the day, we end up sort of coming back and talking about it. We say this is really valuable, but we don't allow it. We keep it as entertainment. So I hope we're seeing a shift in that. And I think we are in a moment where we are. So to say some things about comics, again, I don't really need to tell your audience this, I don't think. But MacLeod's definition, however much we might challenge it, is certainly a useful place, I think, in that it allowed so many other things into the conversation around comics, juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence. I think it allowed so many other things. And I think thinking about time passing through, in the passage of time being written in space, is really an important thing. And in this particular image, I've redrawn a 30,000-year-old lunar calendar, which, showing the phases of the moon over a month, which is essentially, showing time in space. I wouldn't, again, say that that's a comic book, but it's using the same kind of same kind of technology at a very early point in human history. So where I think MacLeod's sort of sequential is useful to think about comics, I think the fact that we see them all at once, take in the page all at once, really changes what comics are. And those who've read theory, Gronstein certainly are aware of his theories around the sort of idea of braiding a page. And I think you can see it, my page was designed here to talk about that. You read it left to right, top to bottom, but you start to make connections across the whole page. You start to make connections. This is the kind of question you might ask an audience. When you encounter a comic, do you read the words first and some hands will go up? Do you read the images first and a different set of hands might go up? And do you have other strategies? So the fact that you can ask how one reads a comic, it's not a question you really ask about text. I know there's certainly speed reading techniques, but you don't jump around in that sort of way. And so in cases, you might encounter the spider in this corner here, and I'm assuming you can see my arrow. And then you might notice a web like here. And so you start to make connections back and forth between the text and image. And so how you read is really sort of unchained from the typical hierarchy of reading. And I take this, I think this page from Watchmen is really crucial to thinking about comics. Here in the center, our Dr. Manhattan in his time-displaced nature is really commenting on comics form. There's no future, there is no past, do you see? And those of you who read it, these panels down here actually take place 30-some years before the events of the story, and yet they're coming after, and they're all visible on the page. So the 9-panel grid I'm referring to here, and I think MacLeod, for as much as MacLeod is talking about sequence, he does certainly allude to this. Both past and future are real and visible and all around us. And I think this page is very much referencing that page there. So I think what it does to comics is it makes them this form that's capable of sequence in a very powerful way, but also capable of the sort of simultaneous. And the fancy word for that is rhizomatic. Everything is sort of interwoven, and the connections are being made in multiple ways rather than purely sequential ways. Right. And I think about our own thoughts, and without going into it very deeply, we're very aware of the sort of linear progression of time. You're in something now, you were in dinner before, however your day, you marched, I assume, linearly through time. But at the same time, your thoughts are unchained from that, and things that I'm saying now may suggest thoughts to you that go off to the side, and you may be thinking about things you're anticipating later. So the comics form allows us to do both of those at once, and I think that's what's really, to me, one of the most exciting things about using the form, and it's their very flat nature, the very fact that they don't move. And that they're flat allows you to care about both the individual drawings and the meta drawing, the whole page. And so you can see it in sort of weird things. I'll let you look at this comic for a second. So our little guy here in Andy Black's Conky Crew Comics, he can't get his fruit, he can't get the fruit, but he can get the fruit because he can go across the page and sort of backwards in space and time in the sort of weird way that only comics allow. And you can see things like this Marc-Antoine Matou's a comic about the Louvre. If you were to see this as 9 separate slides, you would still get the main point of his comic, but you would miss the pyramid being displayed in the whole of the page, which is significant to the page. Frank King's Gasoline Alley. And this comic is so weird, but it doesn't seem weird. But here's our character marching sequentially through the comic. But yet it's a simultaneous scene, and it's even weirder than that in that he keeps restarting on the left, which makes absolutely no sense if you slow down to think about it. But we accept it because of the sort of fragmentary nature of comics. It kind of just reads as normal. But it's a very strange way of looking at things. In Asterius Polyp, David Mazzucchelli addresses this quite directly, talking about simultaneity. The awareness of so much happening at once is now the most salient aspect of contemporary life. And the page itself goes from a sort of sequential to everything starting to happen all at once in the panels and in the sort of mess of the home. And that allows a lot of play with the panels themselves, where panels can become a character in the story. Windsor McCay from 100 and some years ago, Young Avengers from a couple years ago, few years ago, where the panels are both the sequential moments, but they're also acting as this other dimension. And Nina Paley's comic where the panel acts as a sort of psychological dimension. And I have to say, I didn't put the slide in here. If you guys have not seen Mr. Invincible by Pascal, I forget his name, I highly recommend it. If you're interested in the sort of panel breaking awareness of what a comic can do, it's this extraordinary comic. So that leads me to my second formal decision, which is how do I embody the ideas in the very shape of the page, and really thinking about how the reader moves through it. So in this page, this is in the chapter on ruts. So I was contrasting my wife's various commutes through Manhattan with the typical commute, the out and back. And I could have quite easily sort of said, here I am, and I could have in one hand held up somebody's commute, and in the other hand held up my wife's commute and said, look, they're different. But I really don't want to illustrate, and I want to think about how the page can do that work. So in the background grid is this repeated route. It's going the same path. It's the same drawing each time, though it gets darker throughout and the path gets a little bit deeper. And on the layer on top, which is a funny thing to say about a flat piece of paper, I've put Manhattan sort of drifting like a leaf in the way that I sort of thought my wife's commutes changed from day to day, and the locations changed and the order she went to changed. So I think in many ways, even it's a fairly simple page to read, but where you encounter the information is very complex, and it allows you to sort of put an unusual density of information into a single flat piece of paper. This is my comic on entropy. It was in the Boston Globe in 2015 or 16. And I wanted to talk about the idea, the entropy is things fall apart. Your coffee gets cold, your clothes won't pick themselves up. But there are these moments that go against that downward flow, and those are moments like life, where things sort of get more ordered. And so the comic moves left to right, and it starts to move left to right, and it's sort of this yet kicks you over to here. And then it moves, top to bottom, which is fine. And then all of a sudden it says, we're going to go right to left. And then it says, we're going to go bottom to top for a second before kicking you out and sending you back up around. So that idea that comics are not just about putting pictures with words, but really, really unchaining reading from linear order and making it a much more complex arrangement between reader and author. To me, that's where I spend the bulk of my time. For this comic, I have 50 pages in my notebook where I tried to work it out before I got to this one I put a star on, like, how is this going to work? And I say that as somebody who makes really complicated drawings. The figuring out is usually the bigger part of the job. And so I like this. I am assuming Frederick shared this with students. The cartoonist Seth has said comics equals poetry plus graphic design. And I think that's really key. I think about that in terms of my students, that they, if you think about it as illustration, then that's sort of a high bar for what your skills have to be. But if you think about it as sort of poetry and graphic design, it becomes much more about how we think about space and how we organize ideas and images and text in space. And I think that's really has a lot of potential. And that's where, and maybe you guys have done this, I don't know, Frederick, my grids exercise, grids and gestures has come, which is an abstract comics making activity that's done very quickly. And I use it both to get people thinking about how a comics maker thinks about space, but also to think about how much they know about drawing, even if they're someone who says, I don't draw. And then these are just a couple examples, which I don't like to show if you haven't done it. But these are all done in about 7 minutes, where people come up with different ways to organize how they make sense of their day. And the comics forum is really productive for that, I think. And I hadn't done it myself, though I did. So I sort of reverse engineered it for Unflattening. And I had the experience in that book that my wife would walk by where I was working and she would say, oh, I haven't seen a composition like that before. And she'd walk by a couple days later and she'd say, I haven't seen one like that before. So that became this goal to not make any pages that looked the same in how they read. Like each page would have its own reading flow. And in doing so, I mean, no, I'll stop there on that. But I did repeat it once, and I did it with this sequence where I made the grid first, and I was trying to talk about sort of somebody who had a sort of routine every day where they had their sort of morning, they had their commute, and then they had their job, which was kind of a mundane thing, and then they had the reverse commute and their sort of cool down of the day. So I drew the grid first, and then I inhabited it with this puppet character. And the second day I showed, it's pretty much the same until here he discovers this little egg and a thought appears. And the next time it appears, it's still pretty much the same, but this thought has become this hungry caterpillar that is sort of eating through the panels, or his thoughts are dominating. And by the end, it's changed a little bit. And then by the final time I repeat it, it falls apart. And so I think some part of comics making is sort of teaching your reader how to read the page, like how you structure it is sort of showing them how to enter and how to experience it. And so in doing this, I've set this structure up. I've repeated it, but not quite. And then I've let it fall apart. That fall apart has a lot of meaning. And so really thinking about that I said before is how I can embody the idea of the page in the structure. And this is referencing James Joyce's Ulysses, the page about how water flows. And I really wanted it to flow the way I thought about the pipes flowing under your house, or the way a river meanders. And so the page, snakes this way and comes back and comes back. And there's a lot of design choices that allow it to keep moving that way without losing you. This one about Scheherazade, which I'll say a little bit more about later, wanted it to move the way her name feels. This kaleidoscopic page, I just wanted something coming from many, many, many points of view, but with no center. And then this one is interesting because my initial attempt didn't work. And I wanted to talk about the idea of lightness, about something lightening. So there's this pun here that has given lots of people a lot of trouble, and also translators a bit of a nightmare. But because we read, it's hard to break reading from top to bottom. So it makes sense for the page to flow up, but you won't naturally do that. So what I ended up doing here, I mean, this is a fairly simple example, but is flipping the thing so that the images read up, but the text reads down, and they still encounter things in the right way. But I think it made my point so much better to have this final image up high, where things had become lighter than it did to do it in the reverse. And I have turned this into an activity I call Zithers, which is the first thing on my website right now, where I draw these kind of curious paths, and you can make your own, about how the eye should read a page. And then students try to solve these by panel structure, by characters leaping across space, by word balloons and sound effects. Becomes what's interesting to me is it's not just an exercise in like, how do I organize a page, but it ends up generating stories that you don't expect purely from the form. And that's my experience as well. Is like, again, I start pages with some sort of idea of what I want to cover, but I don't, until I start thinking about the kinds of imagery and the kinds of reading flow, it's not until those are part of the equation that I actually figure out what I'm doing. So I think comics are this profound way to get at the complexity of our thinking. And I think Chris Ware's work, the tangents that he allows himself to go into, really demonstrate that well. You can have these static fragment, sort of frozen moments that represent memory. I think that really allows for this to get at how thought works. To get at all the sort of tangents and parentheticals that don't fit so neatly into writing. And the flip side is, I think comics are a really powerful way to generate our thinking. And I say, oh, Frederick, you're requesting something. No, I don't know. There's something popped on my screen. Are we still okay?
Yeah, we're good. I think I might have hit the request control of your thing. But
you want to click through.
I wanted to move faster. Can you no? No, just dismiss whatever notification you have.
All right, I can't, but it disappeared. Okay, well, we're winding down here. So you know, as somebody who works alone, I do see my process as this great partner in that making marks on a piece of paper allows my visual system to interact with them and see new things. Hold on, I've lost control of my screen. You know, so our visual system that is so powerful in allowing us to navigate the world. You know, we see things in clouds, we see things in stains and marks on the ground, and the same is true of our own marks that we make. And so I was really pleased that Harvard let me reproduce some of those sketches in the back of the book. And this was the very first sort of roadmap sketch I make, which is cool to me because of the sort of Easter eggs of what I did and what I didn't do. But I think it's more important to see for people who, you know, are interested in making this kind of work or think they can't, to see like how sketchy it is and how like poorly drawn it is, and that this is really something anyone can do. And furthermore, that, you know, this is not a picture of my thinking. This is it. Without making all these sketches and iterating them over time, I couldn't make the work I make. I'd make some other work, but it's really the sketches that take me somewhere. It's really that act of making drawings, putting words next to them, and like seeing how they connect, and then seeing new connections that generates the work. So I want to take you through 2 pages, and then we'll wind down. This was a page on multimodality, and if multimodality, for those who I'm sure most of you know, but just in case you don't, is the idea that, you know, in addition to communicating through text, things like image and action and gesture and color and all sorts of things are part of our communication. And in education, the more we try to include those, the better textbooks we have, the better we can communicate. So I wanted to explore that, but I don't work in color, so that was never an option. And had I worked in color, this page would have been quite different. So again, I don't have characters. I don't think about this as illustrating, but you know, so I have to find some metaphor, some idea that allows me to get through it, and some kind of movement. So my first idea was an omelet, which seemed okay. You know, an omelet has a bunch of different flavors all put together, but you know, it's different than you can still taste them separately. But it's different than a smoothie where everything's all blended together and becomes like one thing. It seemed okay, but I wasn't super excited. And then I thought about a keyboard. I'm like, well, you have all these different keys, and that seemed okay. And on the same piece of paper, I drew a symphony. And I thought, well, that's the most obvious one, so that's kind of cool. But because I'd drawn them near each other, I thought, well, the conductor is kind of like the space bar, and keyboards used to be curved. And so that's sort of interesting. I've got something there. So I'm sort of continuing, and I drew a head, and I'm thinking, all right, you have all these thoughts inside, and there's your space bar in there, and things come out of your head, but they sort of come through one channel. So as I redrew it, I drew it progressively quicker and more poorly. So I sort of just gridded this out, and I noticed how much this kind of looked like the keyboard. So now I've got keyboard and head, and I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. So as I continue making sketches, it's a little hard to see probably. I have this sort of opening paragraph where I have a series of horizontal strips that like explain multimodality before I get to the large image where I'm demonstrating it. But I've got a problem here. And the problem is very comic specific. I have, you read, and you end up down here. You end up sort of down at the bottom of those horizontal panels, and there's nothing to take you back up. And that's a unique problem to comics. And so I struggled with this for a while. And I'm like, the cheating thing to do would be to put an arrow. And I feel like, you know, Art Spiegelman will come to your house and cane you or something if you do that. So I was about to quit, and I was like, well, I'll just draw this arrow just to see what happens. And in drawing it, and drawing it badly as I did, I saw that how much that arrow I'd drawn looked like my thumb. And so I'm like, oh, of course, that's the right solution, like the hand on the keyboard. I don't know why I didn't think of this before, but I put the hand on the keyboard, and that allows me to move up. So now I just have to solve things. And you can kind of see, I can take you through a little bit of the design choices. There's these thought balloons here, and the bubbles that go to the head are sort of pushed over here. So there's a big gap that keeps you from wanting to leap over to the right side of the page. And they bring you down a little bit, and you hit this thermometer that becomes the person's head. There's a lot of little subtle things that say, stay over on the left, would you please? And then you get down to here, and this box, the only time I think in the comic where the box doesn't end in a corner, it ends in this curve that then takes you into the hand, says, okay, come down here and then leap back up to there, and then you can read the page the rest of the way. So I think what's important in this is that it's both the sort of constraints I set up for myself that generated it, like the kind of metaphorical rules, the space rules, all that sort of play with the sketches that led me to the image, and then it's sort of design choices, the very constraints of working in the comics medium that forced some of the choices I had to make about how you read it and what it looks like. So I think you can see none of this was like, oh, I have this cool idea and I'm going to draw it. Not at all like that. And so the Scheherazade page serves a different example. This is something I did know very early that I wanted to do because I thought, her stories within stories is just such a cool thing to think about. And I had started it, and as I get to the part in the middle of the page where I say by stories, I don't just mean the fantastic or the fabulous kinds of things. I mean things like science. I got stuck, and if I was writing, I could have just said things like science and put a period. And if I was illustrating, I could have done that and like put a picture of Einstein. But here, because I was trying to find something that fit this visual schema, this zoom from image to image to image that I was doing, and also like dealt with the time that the Arabian Nights were written down and where they were written down. I had to find something. So I spent a lot of time sort of researching to find what was going on in science then and in that region of the world. And I stumbled on a work by the man named Al-Tusi, whose work was instrumental in what Copernicus did 300 years later. And I had this page on Copernicus in the second chapter, and I was like, oh, this is fantastic. And so I spent a while trying to figure out how the visual schema works. But eventually, a few weeks of work, all for these 3 panels here in the lower left corner. And I think the point of this is to say, there's nothing in my notes, there's nothing in my outline that says you should research this obscure bit of Arab astronomy and include it in the book. But there is something in the drawings that said, you got to go somewhere that helps you solve the drawings. And it took me in places that I couldn't have expected to go. And I think that's really what's true for me, and I see that as what's true for my students who most of them come to this with much less experience. And so I just want to say a few words about my students before I end with a little bit more about where I'm at now. And so I've been fortunate since I was a grad student to teach comics classes. When I went to Calgary, I got to keep teaching classes. Got to teach with Frederick, which was one of the highlights of my teaching ever. And now I'm at a place where it wasn't exactly, they weren't looking for a comics person when they hired me, but once they had somebody there, they got really excited about it. So I teach comics classes, and I'm trying to do more on drawing my syllabi as I go, and trying to really emphasize, and I just think I'm just sharing this as a general thing, that study and play are really at the heart of my courses, and I think so important to education. And I think it's difficult. We tend to, in the ways that we tend to denigrate art as being something about talent and entertainment, I think we denigrate play in the same way. And I think that does us a disservice. So I just want to show a couple of student works. This is a serious non-drawer. And we had read some graphic medicine titles, read Epileptic, trying to think what else we'd read in there. I'm not thinking right now, but he made this comic about his grandmother. And it's, you can see the drawing skills are very limited, but he's done this wonderful thing. His grandmother had Alzheimer's and he really didn't know her. So he's got this blank panel here. It says, I didn't know my grandma, I was told about her. And then another blank one, this person no longer existed. And then down here, then she was nobody. So, he's used nothing to say some of the most powerful things I think he could have done. So I think, I show this a lot to my students to say, look, it's about using the form to make meaning. It's not about how well you draw or not. It's the more you understand the form, the better you can do with it. I show this is from a student who's quite a great drawer. She came in as a great drawer and has only gotten stronger. But I share this. She did this wonderful thing, and I assume you can see the arrow that I'm moving around. She says, you don't have to be a Leonardo da Vinci to make interesting and impactful artwork. And her figure sort of leaps across McLeod's triangle and sort of changes its form depending on where it is in the triangle. And I don't know exactly why I'm showing you hers, except that it's really cool. And I see this, you know, she came from art school, and I think this really liberated her from some of the constraints of art school that were holding her back. And then I share this one. This is the one I've shared the most to end talks. This was at the University of Calgary in a class I solo taught. A non-drawer, very shy student, and I'll just take you through it. So on the left side there's these negative words that she's holding up, and so sometimes she can feel the weight of the words on her shoulders. And on the right it says, but she is strong, and there's these positive words emanating from the sun shape there. And she played a lot with the panels, and some of my stuff that I showed on panel breaking sort of came because I had the student who was sort of interested in that. This is a story about a girl who couldn't fit in a box, and they laughed from their boxes that fit as she contorted and twisted, unable to find a place. And finally, so she makes her own box out of words, sounds, and pictures, and soon she learns that there is no need for borders, that boxes restrict her unnecessarily, since she can go anywhere she wishes. And I find this, I mean, I've read it to people a couple hundred times, I think, like one of the most profound things that I've ever seen as a professor. And again, not because of particular skill, but because she really understood how to get at her thinking in ways that she couldn't have without the form. And I think that's something everybody can do. And I think that's really a strength of comics. And so I want to close with just a little bit about the future work. I think comics really offer us a different way of thinking. And to quote Topfer here, you know, that he says, luckily, so he thought, little artistic skill is needed for telling a story in pictures. And I, you know, I love skilled comics, but I've come to love ones that come from a very different place. I've been fortunate to see, I had a student make a dance out of some of the stuff I'd done. And I share that I share that because I think finding the ways that we can make sense of the world and integrating them into our work is just such an important thing. And I've become quite interested in sort of dance and movement in the body, and thinking about drawing as a way of thinking, but thinking about movement as a way of thinking. And so in my own work, I've come to almost consider it more like choreography, more like I'm organizing images and ideas in space, and I'm thinking about the timing of them. And you know, choreography is something, sort of the rhythms of the world are something where we come in, before we come into the world, we're a part of. The rhythms of your mother's heartbeat, of the lungs coming in and out. There's all these sort of sensations that you are sort of keeping time with from before you're born, and continue to do, I'm going to skip through those, continue to experience, you know, the rest of your life. And so we're sort of organizing ourselves around the patterns that we experience and making sense of them. And I think comics give us this really interesting way to make sense of them. And so just one more thought here about the new work. I like this quote from Maxine Sheets Johnson: movement is our original mode of thinking. Thinking begins in movement. And again, I think when you see some of the things I've done, my ideas didn't really come from me knowing what I was doing. They came from me making marks, from me looking, from me moving my hand. They didn't come sort of fully formed like Athena out of Zeus's head. They came from this play and letting me discover things. And I think on the subject of movement, this is about a little over a year ago. It's my boy trying to navigate under our table legs and chairs. The kinds of processing he's doing to like weave his body through all these, you know, through the legs and chairs, and to know how wide his hips are. It's an extraordinary amount of information he's dealing with at all the time. And we sort of take it for granted. You know, we're so good at it, we take it for granted, and we tend to leave it out of what thinking looks like. And I'd like to think a lot about how we bring that back in, what we learn through our bodies, through the acts of drawing, and how that can help us ask our own questions. So the final thing, I don't know, I keep saying final thing, so maybe this will be the final thing, really. I'm good at drawing badly, but I'm just going to show you a tiny bit, and then This is from the new work, which has taken me forever and is going to take me more forever given the current state of the world. But it's fun and I'm having a good time. And I feel like in making the first book, I really was exploring what I could do with comics. And this time I think I've learned a lot from teaching and from making. And it's exciting to sort of push on and see what more I can do. So I think I'm going to say thank you and figure out how to stop sharing, because I think you've seen enough. I'm going to stop the share as soon as I figure out. Did I stop?
Yes. Well, I think you're still sharing something. Here we are.
There we are. I see you, Frederick, and I see Raina.
Thanks so much, Nick. That was really wonderful. And thanks for sharing those images from the new work. That was really cool to see.
Yeah.
We'll open it up for questions or comments right away.
Can't answer them all at once, so.
Okay.
All right, Simon.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Nick.
Hi.
I'm a MA student doing American Studies. Not that I suppose matters greatly, but anyway, we went. We had a kind of visit through Unflattening this morning, and I was immediately struck by the comparison with Piranesi, the drawings of Piranesi, and also by the fact that they were in a book, whereas Piranesi's drawings were generally weren't, I don't think, bound, but they were in a book, and that that kind of had a sense of order about it. That the book was an enclosure which could be a prison, it could be a city, but the parts within the book represented were smaller representations of the city, both in terms of gridded. This is what I think made it particularly American, gridded structure, but also places of entertainment where the thing went off on some kind of serpentine line. But what troubled me is the missing element in the city, which was that kind of collision between people, and which is the most entertaining and for me the richest part of city living, says the man who's just moving out of London. But there we go. So yeah, that did trouble me. That in fact what happened was that as you built up these kind of small units to a bigger unit, which then went into the box, that missing from that was the kind of adventitious, the kind of odd happenstance that comes around from different people having different ideas. And that if there was something which was particularly American about this, it was that the solution to the problem, and I presume you're making an argument. I mean, I think you're making an argument, and that the images there both introduce and intensify the argument, and you know that's I envy the skill that goes into that. But the thing that was missing was the collision of different arguments, for me at any rate. So maybe you can relieve me of a misapprehension in this respect.
I have to make sure I understand your question. You know, are you specifically speaking to the first chapter or the whole? Well,
if I'm honest, the first chapter, what seemed to me, first of all, is the bit I recognized the most in, you know, that this was something that is either referred to or just accidentally happened to represent or refer to something which I'm very familiar with, which is the drawings of Piranesi and also the structures that are formed by people who are interested in Piranesi. So that probably did temper my appreciation of the whole work. But I think there's I don't know if you've got the chat line on the side there, but there's a quotation from Leone Battista Alberti, which is about the way that cities are organized. But what he does as well is he doesn't include people in his cities. You know, it's all about the plan.
I mean, so I don't know that. I mean, I think I appreciate the part about collisions quite a bit, which is something, I mean, I don't know that I would address it in a visual way in the book. I don't think I did. I think it's sort of inherent to the argument, is that part of the idea is that how do we bring together multiple viewpoints to change our own viewpoint, right? I mean, I think, God, it's such a hard problem, at least in our country, and I don't know, it doesn't seem like things there are dramatically different. How do we, there are some, I mean, sorry, this is going to be a tangent here, but I feel like there are not schools of thought, there are unschools of thought that are like polar opposite to what most of us perceive as reality. And I'm thinking of my mother-in-law, sadly, right now, like that are just like in some other universe. And how do you collide with them hard enough to say, hey, that this is not what's going on? I mean, I don't know that you're speaking to that at all, but that's where it makes me think. The thing I shared in the chat, so my interest in Piranesi, so I'm from Detroit, or I was in Detroit, and I mean, I like those images, so I started playing with them while I was doing some master's classes in lithography, and then I made this billboard, which is shared there, that was on Woodward Avenue, which is the oldest paved road. And so the imagery originally came to me so much thinking about car culture in our country in particular, the ways that we're sort of all getting our separate boxes and are sort of isolated down that. So collision's an interesting thing to think about when you're thinking about car culture. So I'll say, when I was trying to figure out how I wanted to represent, what I wanted to represent, the flatness of thought, having that imagery already in my vocabulary sort of became a thing that I could use. I mean, because that was really a hard part of the book, was like, what am I drawing, right? It's like a really hard thing to think about. So I'm still not answering your question, but but that it very much came out of car culture, and then I thought was applicable to what I was trying to think about, in terms of education, in terms of people being put on paths and sent down systems. How do we get out of that? I think you're quite right. It's about colliding, right? It's about speaking across boundaries. But I'm not sure that's what you're asking. That's the part and I also don't, it doesn't come. I mean, I think if I have a shortcoming in the book, which I don't really want to spend the whole time talking about that, but is that some of the, returning to some of that imagery and spending time shattering it I didn't leave a lot of space for that. Partly I'd graduated and it sort of ended, and partly, I didn't think of everything. I mean, the beauty of getting to do a second one is that hopefully you've figured out the things you didn't do and want to do them the next time. But go ahead. You were going to elaborate more.
No, I wasn't. I think the way you did answer the question, because when you mentioned car culture, which simply hadn't occurred to me. I mean, as a generator of the pages I was looking at, it has to be said that car culture is the most atomizing experience that one can imagine, short of polar exploration, I suppose. But yeah, so that in a way does answer my question. So thank you.
Oh, well, that was accidental. I didn't.
There you go.
There you go. Well, thank you. I mean, I have to say, I think this also addresses your question. One of the things I feel luckiest about with the work is that I've had so many conversations with so many different people that see the work in, I had students asking me about the criminal justice aspect of the book, right? Like what do I know, right? And I just had a conversation with people at Google who are talking about it in a completely different context about the work that I would never have thought of, right? So, the sort of collision of ideas here, like what you've pointed out, I mean, I have to think about it, right? But it's really a gift to get to have these other perspectives and hopefully push me, I mean, anyway, okay, I'll stop. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Nick and Simon. Any other questions for Nick?
Can't possibly have answered them all. maybe
And yes.
you guys are so polite with like turning off your screens in between. I haven't seen that before.
Sorry, were you saying me, Frederick?
Yes, Fern, please go for it.
Oh,
Hi, I'm Fern.
hi.
That was really good. That was really interesting. Thank you. What I found fascinating was your like sketch maps, like how you kind of had your thoughts, both visual and words. Because when I read this, I was quite interested in like what came first, like what.
Yeah.
Because I always find, because I try and make like only a few comics. I'm very new to it, but I struggle to get the words right or the images right. Like I either write an essay first and then go, how can I make this visual? But I'm really interested in, from the sketch maps to your finished product, what is your process?
Well, I mean, I don't, yeah, I mean, what I showed is a big chunk of it. I mean, I will say there is a typed part, like I'll make sketch maps, but it's hard to keep track of them, right? Like, so the typed part is partly, it's like, I don't know, scaffolding or something. Like if I don't do it, I'll forget the things that I drew. So I'll type out everything that I made in my sketch map, and then I'll make more drawings. So I have this. I would never call it a script because it's not. There's nothing script-like. I mean, there might be words that I end up using, but there's not like panel 1 say this. None of that exists in it. So it's just a way of like, you can, you know, it's a database, right? I can search a page of text that is really difficult to search a page of images. So I'll start making those things, and then as I get closer to a chapter, I think they start to take shape, and I've like moved them around, and then I've moved them around. Let me see. Can I do the share again? Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I wasn't asking permission as much as I was asking if I technically could. Let me see. So, can you see this, Fern?
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is beyond the sort of map of the book. This is the new one, but this is a map of a chapter. So let me see. Yeah, this is I don't think this is quite the final draft of the chapter. This is the one I'm almost done with. But you can see up here, like there's some typed notes, right? And there's this play of it. And I think, let me see. This is the chapter before. Oh, this is maybe even better. This is the one I've showed a few images from. You can see, so this is a chapter that's continuous, like there's page spreads, but they also could be viewed as a scroll or sort of tapestry thing. That I've figured out not all the text, but lots of bits of the text, and I figured out where you're going to read, because each page has a different reading path on it. So I mapped that out pretty extensively while I'm working out the page. But it's then when you go to, I think that's enough sharing. It's when you go to, sorry, I'm going to stop the share. For me, it's when I go to making the actual page, and I do my actual pages on computer, that I realize how much, you know, I have a pretty good sense of how many words might fit here and here, but I don't, there are, you know, when you're starting to like put them in boxes and things, I start cutting a ton of words, you know, so maybe like in my notes, I have like 4 versions of how I might say something, like, and I have like one word that I absolutely need, because I think that while mine is very difficult in planning the movement of it, it is also, you know, the words are sort of hyper precise to mean exactly what I mean, but also to be as ambiguous as possible for the person who doesn't know what I'm, you know. So it's a tricky dance on that. And so while I'm making the actual page, I will be like editing words and cutting to try to fit the space. And occasionally I do the reverse, because I'm like, I need this box to take up more space. So I'm like, I'm going to say this in a longer way. That's rare, but not impossible. So I think the constraint, I mean, I really think the constraint of working in comics makes me a better word person, because I don't have much space, right? You know, and I will often use boxes to intentionally cover something, because I think that's a strength of comics, is that you can include things and you still know what's going on behind it, so it's okay. So I don't know, did that answer much of your question? Was it, I mean, for me, they happen at the same time, and it may be that sometimes I like really, I'll put all the words on and I'll like really get them tight before I make the final drawings, or sometimes it'll be the other way around. Oh wait, I saw your comic. Is that right, Frederick?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, hey, nice to meet you. Sorry, I had to, should have said that at the start. I mean, I think, how much can the images do for you? How much can you get them to do for you? And I think that allows you to cut out lots of words. And I think that's, I mean, I look at some of my earlier things and I think they're a lot wordier. And even Unflattening, I think, is a little bit wordier than the current book is going to be. And it's all, I mean, I know for me, it's the placement of the words is so important. So sometimes there's a phrase that I like would be very easy for me to say in writing, but because the drawing works this way and like I want the words to be next to this part of the drawing. So I have to figure out, I use a lot more passive voice than my English teachers would approve of, I think, but it's partly because I'm trying to figure out some sort of backwards way to write the words so that they intersect with the images where they are supposed to. And I know for translators, there's got to be some just absolutely nightmarish things, because you're using words that speak very specifically to the image, but then when you use it in another language, that that may break down, right? So it's a tricky thing. I don't know, but I could share with you or share with Frederick to you. Sometimes I've documented the whole arc of, like each iteration of the page, and how, sometimes images change even after the sort of sketch phase, kind of dramatically, because words have sent me in a different direction, and like there'll be still a lot of movement all the way till nearly the end, because they're just not. In my case, it's because I find that I'm illustrating or I'm explaining too much, and I find like that just, for me, that's not what I want to do. I don't, it doesn't sit with me very well. So I will keep pushing on it until it has the kind of relationship that I want to have. So I don't know. I mean, this is a longer conversation with you now that I know who you are. Sorry about that. But I think it's one you learn as you do it. I think you just, and again, my feeling is the more you sort of try to work these things out in your sketch maps, the more you start to see, well, do I really want this much text, or can I do it with this? Or maybe I need, maybe this now needs to become 3 pages because I have so much I want to say, or, but I think you'll just figure it out. You'll figure out, well, how little can I say here?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks for your comic. I really enjoyed it. And yeah.
Thanks so much. Raina, did you appeared just before? Did you have a question?
I have many notes and some ill-formed thoughts, but I don't know if I have a question. I can try. Hang on.
Well, ill-formed thoughts are the best.
So I was just like Fern was doing before. I was fascinated by the kind of transitions from your planning process and your mapping processes into the final pages. And I was really struck by the way you seem to move between different forms of abstraction as you do that, and different forms of metaphor as you do that. And I just wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about either abstraction or your use of metaphor within those processes, if that's okay. That may be impossibly big or impossibly small. I don't know.
It's big. Yeah, that's really big. But that's okay. I mean, I don't know that I don't know what to answer that. My first thought sort of addresses the first question a little bit. Like, I set up this sort of rules for myself about, I don't really draw any real people I mean, occasionally I'm in the book as like to tell a story or something, or there's a famous photo, the Mona Lisa's in there or whatever. And so I'm struggling with this right now because I'm drawing this whole chapter of babies, and like, I don't want to draw I don't mind drawing real babies. It's hard and it's a terrible thing to do to yourself. But there's no reason for real people to be in there, right? And so if there are, then all of a sudden that comes with like, why did you draw that person, right? Like that comes kind of loaded. So it's an interesting, like some of my goals with these figures in the first chapter, which are all male in the first chapter, they're not in the later ones when you sort of show how they came to be. I had this idea that they were sort of like molded things and they're all supposed to be molded a certain way. But because of the kind of rules I set up for myself, by the time I got to the end, I wanted to only keep things in metaphor. And yet I think some of the sort of critiques which resemble a little bit of what I think the first question is that I never showed them as sort of real people in the end, which is maybe a shortcoming on my part, but it's partly because I'd set up all these rules that said I'm not going to do that, right? Like I'm only going to keep things in these sort of cultural references or metaphorical. So in retrospect, I think I would have revisited them in a very different way, but it's not. It sort of boxed myself into a corner and didn't know how to leap out. Does that or help you come up with more of a question?
I don't know. I think it's inspired about 5 others.
Oh, well, then I'm on fire then.
Yeah. I love the idea of the kind of metaphor here because it plays across both the language and the visuals, and it's something that works on both levels. And you were just talking before with Fern about how in getting from the kind of planning stages to the final page, you're kind of cutting out words. I wonder maybe if a similar thing is happening with the visuals as well. Then if you've set those rules for yourself, are you actually building in more detail and more metaphor through the visuals as you cut words, or is that process kind of intentional all the time?
Yeah, I think that's a page by page question. I think it depends. It's interesting. Again, I'll sort of go back to the first question. Like the first chapter in Unflattening was very intentionally like overly drawn. Like there's all these infinite scenes. I really wanted to say this guy can draw, right? Like I'm an academic, but I wanted it very clear to everyone that I knew how to draw things that look like things, and to sort of be this sort of like really impactful opening. Because I intended to sort of let both the form slide, because the form gets much crazier after that, and the sort of images. Occasionally I do these very flat sort of design images, which I quite like doing, but I struggle to trust it. Like my flatness is to sort of default to a guy who grew up reading 70s and 80s superhero comics, right? So it's as much as I try to sort of push myself in other ways, I don't spend enough time drawing, I think, to like learn how to break that. So again, the first chapter was like, there's these rules about how it's going to be. And then after that, I try to let go of it, though I keep coming back to those characters some, just because we've set them in place. I lost what I was trying to answer here. I don't know. I lost it. Sorry. I was going somewhere.
It sounds almost like you're saying that as you're clarifying the meanings you want to come out of the process for yourself, you're going deeper into the metaphors within the imagery and the text. Do you think am I understanding that right?
That sounds nice. I like that. I like that a lot. I don't know. I like that a lot, what you said. Yeah. Frederick,
it's interesting for me as a reader because I'm now kind of, after listening to you tonight, I'm totally reinterpreting everything I've read of yours and kind of thinking about the process. No, it's right. More deeply, but thinking about the processes that went into it really, really helps, I think, because I think for a reader, there's often an implicit understanding of those patterns. You're kind of reading the patterns and you're seeing the patterns, and And then you get into the kind of deeper meanings and the metaphors that come out of those patterns. And so I've been absolutely blown away by seeing the original sketches and seeing how they then build up into those more complex, but also abstracted but clarified metaphors over time. So thank you so much. It's been really a joy. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Raina. Yeah, I mean, it's a fun I mean, it's interesting. So the new work, the opening is all this retelling of the Odyssey, but not really. I mean, it is incredibly accurate to things that happen in the Odyssey, but it doesn't actually have anything to do with it, except that it holds it together. So I had a lot of things to draw. Like I knew and I had a style to draw in, which also is abandoned in the second half of that chapter. Yeah, I don't know. I think right now I'm in this place where I want to, and even then, to think about like what does the page need? What does the idea need? And each, I can see how for some readers it might be a turnoff. I mean, I think this. Well, I'm not saying you, but I think the strength. I mean, because it's hard, right? It's harder. Like the strength. I mean, I am a huge, I'm a fan and a friend of McLeod's, but this is not a critique at all, but I think the people who sort of copied that, which has been many sort of, I think that they're saying, oh, this is how you explain things in comics. And I think that's fine. I mean, that's a fine thing, but I don't think comics can do so much, right? Comics can tell, you can draw illustratively and do things, but then you can also shatter the page and have the movements do things, and you can draw flat. You can draw these very flat kinds of drawings, and so anywhere in between. And I'm not much of a cartoonist. I mean, I'm not I'm very sort of I'm against illustrating in my work, but my skills are very much like an illustrator. I draw much more like an illustrator draws, I think, than a cartoonist draws. I struggle with that. I would like to teach myself to be a cartoonist, but that's so what's that?
You had up earlier where you were talking about comics as poetry plus graphic design, because I think that encapsulates those tensions really nicely, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it's not just the poetry of words, it's also the poetry and movement of images. And so there's a lot in there.
There's a lot, and there's so much. I mean, I feel like you'd think you get faster as you get better at this, but I think I'm actually getting a little bit slower, because partly life is more complicated now, but also I feel like I'm thinking of so many more ways to make the things work. And I really I almost put this in the slides about constraints. Frederick and I were colleagues in Calgary with the constraint poet Christian Book. Maybe some of you know, Christian is famous for this book Eunoia, where he each chapter has only a single vowel in it. So there's this A chapter, and I'll type the name of it in here. Eunoia. It's a real word, I guess. Anyway, you can find it. I was in a conversation with Christian and some other people, and Christian said this thing like the reason sort of this kind of poetry fails is not because it had too many constraints, is because it didn't have enough. And I think, so in Christian's work, yes, it's not just that he used only words with an A in chapter A, it's that he also thought about the sort of rhythms of it and the metaphors of it and the whatever, I don't know all those things. And so for me, I think, so there's some basic things like I'm not the narrator, right? So that's, maybe I am, but I'm not there's no visible narrator that walks you through it. So that's one thing. Then I'm going to do everything in my power to not name the discipline I'm talking about or the field I'm talking about. I've done all those things, right? That doesn't mean there isn't some hard words, but the hard words aren't of that nature. And then, so those are rules. And then the next rule is, how does the page going to feel? How does this feel? Well, the page about my wife's commute, I saw this leaf falling in front of me and I thought, oh, that looks like Manhattan. That's kind of how she I don't know, the situation international, situationist international's derive, that's what they're talking about. And so I was like, oh, all these pieces come together. So those are a set of rules, but I feel like when my pages, and this maybe goes back to the last question, when my pages don't work, they're operating on a couple of those levels, but they're not, but I'm still, they're still either too illustrational or they haven't hit that part where all the constraints are being followed. And I think, I'm very much not mystical, but I do feel like when I put enough of those things in place and I just sort of hang on, eventually the page teaches me where to go. And it means a lot of sketching and a lot of redrawing. And I'll say this maybe to the last question or two. I was stuck on the new book for about a year when I actually did have time to work on it. And I had most of like the arc of what I wanted to cover, and I'd read all this stuff, and I spent probably a year. I just kept trying to read harder. And I would sit there and read harder and think harder. And I'm like, the whole book is about moving and drawing as a way of thinking. So I finally, I got my big notepads out, and I just started making marks, and I'm like, just make them and see what happens. And as I was doing it, I started to notice, oh, I have this old comic I did here that and then all of a sudden everything had, like in a span of 3 hours, the entire first chapter. I mean, there are more wrinkles added after, but the entire thing finally happened. And it wasn't until I sort of trusted the thing that I was already talking about, and I should know better. But it's hard. Like, we're so schooled in this is the way thinking is done. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I do it with every page. I still will try to think rather than move. Anyway, thanks, Raina. I don't know that I even sort of addressed anything you said, but
Thank you. No, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nick. Any other questions for Nick?
They have these pastel dots looking at me, but
where are we?
Yeah.
It's back for more.
Yeah, well, it's so much fun last time, you see. Well, actually, I was just going to ask you something which is nothing to do with comics, but I wondered if you'd ever seen a building generated from a single line or dot or splotch on a page. Because I think if you had, you'd be impressed by how organized you are. And I can tell you that, whilst you may think of the way you work as slightly chaotic and disorganized and perhaps not fully functional all the time, trust me, when it comes to designing buildings, it's a lot crappier and messier, and it's just ridiculous. So yeah, I'd put it in that perspective. To my way of thinking, you look super organized.
Well, I'll take it. I'm just going to share something because you said it. I think this was something I put on Twitter, but I realized I'm very good at drawing badly, and I really do try to draw intentionally badly, and this happened. You can see this is the axe that Athena is released from Zeus's head, and it's spinning backwards in time, and there's a lot going on there. But I drew it really badly right here, and in drawing it really badly, I thought it looked a lot like a lighthouse, and it's sort of there's a crucial I forget now, I'm blanking on the name of the lighthouse in ancient Alexandria, but it's that one. It looks like that. And it's also the word, though it's not exactly, this is something I didn't know, for the kind of shroud that Penelope is weaving and unweaving each night. So there's this sort of accident of me drawing this axe that looks a little bit to me like a lighthouse with the light coming out, that then allowed me to make some connections. Not all of which were true, but they were all fruitful. They were all extremely fruitful for what I was doing. But so yeah, I don't know. Architects are cool. That's what I'll leave it at that.
Right.
No, the architecture is cool. Maybe the architects themselves. I don't actually know any personally, but I'll leave it.
Jeraine. Your microphone is still off, Jeraine. Maybe that's.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. Sorry,
Hey.
it just took a second. Hello. I wondered if you could talk more about like what your next steps are going to be, or if you're going to have any next steps about connecting dance with comics.
Oh, that's an interesting. So I don't know that I have an easy answer. I did a team up. I have a friend who's a drawing researcher and another colleague that I know through an education conference who's a dance professor, and we've done it a few times now. A collaboration where we did a performance at the beginning where like the drawer made marks that the dancer responded to, and I drew some compositions that then they moved through, so and projected. And so we've done that. And then we segued that into a workshop where we took, people through some of those steps, some of my comics making things and some dance things and some drawing things, and sort of wove them together, which was really, they end with making a sort of a comics, a collaborative comics page as a piece of choreography that then they performed, which was really interesting. This is all done in an hour and a half, so it's not, but still surprisingly good, like to go from the chaos of the first 5 minutes to to what happens in the end was surprisingly good. I think for me, in my own work, this book is, I think some of the things that I've talked about in Unflattening have been a lot about drawing as thinking and moving as thinking, but I haven't, that's not really in the book. That's more about when I talk about my own process. So this one, I want to make much, the second chapter that I've been working on that talks about an unborn baby's experience and a newborn's experience, which is all about movement, right? It's all about, I see my boy, like, I don't know, a blender is going and he starts like shaking to the rhythm of the blender, right? Like we're awash in this stuff, and I don't know exactly how to deal with that, but I do think about it in terms of how I compose a page, or in terms of, because again, I struggle with the word illustrator. I struggle a little bit with cartoonist, but choreographer, comics person as a choreographer kind of makes sense to me. Like we're how do you experiencing these rhythms? I don't know. I don't know exactly how that'll take shape, but I feel like there's just so much to be learned from, as educators, from how people move and how we incorporate that. In terms of what it actually will look like and what I make, that's a little harder for me to know now. I have it mapped out, but when it actually get to those parts, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I am sure that watching small children is really instructive about the world, but
yeah,
I'm not sure where exactly. Do you have some ideas?
Oh yeah, thousands. But yeah. I think that's I think there's something about embodiment and about the movement of drawing and the movement of articulation. I think there's connections between those two things. And I think that like comics are like some aspects of comics owes a lot to performance art, but I think there's lots of things that performance art can learn from comics as well. So I think it's a two-way corridor. It's just early days.
Yeah. I think they're exciting. As somebody who got this alternative scholarship through, I think what would I do if I had a dancer come to me and say, I want to do this? And I think comics are in some way sort of an easier thing, right? They have words, you can still cite things. It's not that big a leap to go from text to comics. It has been, but in, it's still on paper. It still does things that look like a book, right? But dance clearly doesn't. So how do we think about that in terms of thinking? And you know, I would love to have that student because I think I would learn a lot. And I would learn a lot just about what that means, but I think I would bring it back to my own work in ways that I can't anticipate really. But I think, you know, so my daughter's 6 now, and I'm thinking she had this amazing dance teacher when she was 4.5 or 5. And she did, and Frederick my grids and gestures exercise, which gets people thinking about drawing like very quickly. But she did these things like let's make they make different shapes with their bodies or different kinds of movements, right? Like it's very contemporary dance rather than like, here's the things. It's like, so everyone make a sharp, or everyone be low and make a, you know, so you like a soft shape or a sharp shape or a hard shape. And I think those things are sort of, you know, that's kind of where drawing is. I think for me, if we can reframe drawing less as, you know, a particular set of illustrational skills and more as a way of making sense of thought on external from your head, right? Like putting it down. So dance does that in a sort of kinetic and ephemeral way, right? Like it's there and it's gone unless you capture it. But drawing freezes it, right? Drawing has got it frozen. And then if you introduce comics into that, you've not only sort of frozen the movements, but you've also, the time is encoded there too, because you can do it through the way you organize the space. So I don't know, that sounds cool now that I say that out loud.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Well, yeah, I think there's stuff like Laban notation, which is a choreographic practice of both drawing and writing of movements, but it is about kind of like freezing it and locking it into place. But there's a whole world of crossover here that could be really exciting. But
yeah,
thank you very much.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll talk more on that.
Sure.
I'm sorry I don't already own it, but it is now ordered. So
thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. Any maybe last questions for Nick before we end?
Raina came back very strongly.
Sorry, I just had my computer just died.
Oh.
I came back because I was trying to get back in for 10 minutes. Sorry.
No worries.
I missed some of that, but it sounded.
Oh, you missed. It was life changing.
I bet it was.
It was a little bit. I'm gonna look up Norman McLaren's animation because that's not something or at least I don't know by name. But
he did some fantastic short animation experiments for the National Film Board of Canada, so a lot of them are online free.
Cool.
And one of the series he did was of ballerinas dancing, and it was kind of time-lapse exposure differences. So it kind of, again, like Geraint was talking about, captures the motion, but also through still images and through making the stillness clear even within the movement.
I missed that last sentence you cut out.
Yeah,
right.
sorry, I might have to go, but it makes the stillness within the movement clear in those experiments, which is really helpful, I think. Maybe.
Cool. Well, I marked them. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, you guys. Are we?
Yeah.
Do you have any questions, Frederick? Anything earth-shattering from having seen me a couple times in the last few years?
Nothing too earth-shattering, I think. I don't know if I have any questions. It's always really fascinating for me to hear about your process, especially because I was looking at recently just some of the scripts that Alan Moore writes for has written, I guess, when he makes comics, and it's always just like so unbelievable to me how he has it all planned out, and he, you know, the level of detail that's like written out before, and he's just sort of like conjuring it up in his mind before he even like sends it off to then the person who's going to draw it, right? And so it's so, I mean, it's always really interesting to see sort of the opposite version of that, right? Where it's all about like the process of drawing. And I don't actually know if Alan Moore does any kind of, I mean, if he draws out anything when he writes those scripts, because I've only ever seen the script.
Yeah, it's unclear to me. I mean, you know, he was a drawer, right? And I think that really shows in his scripts that he's, I do a thing in my class where I give him a 1 page from an Alan, well, it's not 1 page, it's like 5 pages, but it's 1 page of comics from an Alan Moore script, and then 1 from a Neil Gaiman script. And then my students draw them, and the Neil Gaiman one says very, it's pretty loose, right? Like it's very literary, but it doesn't say anything about the structure of the page. And you can see the artist diverge from it dramatically. And the Moore one is like, he's. I'm reading this comment here. Maybe he does. I've never seen his thumbnails either. I would be really curious. My sense is that he operates. Whatever he's figured out in his head is he's able to see something about the page that I don't know how one does. I actually don't think they're, I really like his scripts. I find them liberating if I were to be a drawer, because he's thought about all these kinds of problems in the page and has a very strong thing, but you can still bring yourself to it. I know others. Yeah, I'd be really curious to see, if this Maggie Gray has some sketches of his, please share.
Well, he wrote a whole book. I don't know if it's from that about Alan Moore. So.
I have a couple of those books, but I haven't spent any time with him because I haven't taught him in a while.
But it's interesting to think, because it's not, his scripts are often reproduced sort of, in the special edition of the book or something like that. But
I do have the book, yeah.
But I've never encountered his thumbnails or sketches then, so it would be interesting to see those. Yeah,
I would be really intrigued because it's a really fascinating thing. I've spoke to J.H. Williams about, or I've heard him speak about drawing Promethea and particular the Mobius strip page, which Moore had a lot of descriptions and Williams couldn't really follow them, and so he just did what he did, which turned out to work amazingly. But it was really interesting to see that dynamic. Anyway, cool.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for locking up, and thanks for coming out, Nick. That was
that was fun. I'm glad the timing worked, and good to see you and all the others. Thanks for the questions and making me think. Oh, there's other people out there. Hey, I'll type to them. Thanks. All right, you guys all have a great day or great night. Nighttime, right?